As South Africa, we are not anyone's enemy. I always tell my foreign minister colleagues, we don't seek to make enemies of anyone. What we seek to create are opportunities for our country, our people, and for the continent. And where we see wrong, we will take a moral stand. So on the question of Palestine, we are clear. It is immoral what is happening to the Palestinian people. We will also take a stand on what is happening in Sudan, on what is happening in the Sahel, and several other African countries. South Africa must play a role equitably everywhere to ensure peace and development and to utilize our achievement of democracy to support the achievement of democracy and development in all parts of the world. You know that today we are seeing the bombardment of innocent Palestinian civilians who played no role in the Hamas attack of October 7th. Those innocent civilians have no protection whatsoever. It should be the responsible of the United Nations to ensure peace enforcement and protection of civilians. What the current calamity illustrates is that we don't have proper security architecture, which can, through leadership of AU or SADC or the United Nations, offer protection to ordinary civilians who have no role in a conflict and played no contribution in initiating it. So we believe that there needs to be very firm attention to the matter of security architecture within our region, at the continental level, and globally through the United Nations. One of the things that we need to do is that we must address the ending of the dependence of Africa. Africa is an extremely rich continent with a majority of poor people. Largely, the reason is we do not control our own resources. I often tell journalists who interview me on this question of Palestine that, one of the intriguing realities of our history of struggle is that all African members of the Organization of African Unity stood with the anti-apartheid cause. And the Palestinian people are unfortunate because they're not getting a similar support from their region. But with us, Africa stood with us. And thus we must always stand with Africa.
And gentlemen, I'm glad you have risen. For the one and only, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pandor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Program Director. I must confess that it is very nice to have young people clapping for me. It's most unusual. Normally, they're saying things like, why are you still here? You should retire. Or go and look after your grandchildren and stuff like that. And I usually say to them, my grandchildren have parents who must look after them. It's not my job to look after grandchildren. And then they say, but when are you going to leave Parliament? You should go. We're tired of you. And I say, just to irritate you, I'll be here till I'm 90. All right, so it's lovely to get this welcome from you all. Allow me to begin. I was asked to talk about partnerships, international partnerships for advancing democracy and development. I want to begin by saying one of the most important changes that occurred on the African continent was the embrace of democracy and the commitment to implement and search for practices of good governance. One of the things we must never allow to happen is disrespect for the right of our people to choose who should govern them. This is a very important aspect of democracy, and it must be non-negotiable. But we also have to begin to get public representatives and governments that understand that their role is to respect the people's right to choose their own leaders as well as their own destiny. Too many countries on our continent have a democratic deficit. Indeed, it's true that there have been changes, there have been advances, but there's inadequate democracy, and we need to do more to build it throughout the continent of Africa. We also must ensure that we empower young people to be able to drive this change for the good for our continent. You will recall that our former president, President Thabo Mbeki, framed the notion of the rising of Africa by coining the concept, the African Renaissance, and by placing it firmly at the center of South Africa's foreign policy. So for South Africa, Africa is at the heart of our foreign policy. And you would recall President Mbeki further articulated this significance through his speech at the adoption of our Constitution on the 10th of May, 1996, when he said, "I am an African," and set out through that speech the framework of an African agenda for South Africa. Following that important and epoch-marking speech, South Africa became actively involved in the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, and our President Mbeki served as the first chair of the newly established African Union. Now, it's always important to recognize the significance of the Organization of African Unity to South Africa, and hence the significance of having Africa as our priority focus in our foreign policy. I often tell journalists who interview me on this question of Palestine that, one of the intriguing realities of our history of struggle is that all African members of the Organization of African Unity stood with the anti-apartheid cause. And the Palestinian people are unfortunate because they are not getting a similar support from their region, but with us, Africa stood with us. And thus we must always stand with Africa. One of the areas we've got to address on our continent, if we are to achieve the level of progress that is necessary for true development, we've got to combat unconstitutional changes of government on the continent. We must tell the military that they haven't been given the wisdom of knowing how you govern democratically. They should remain in the barracks, and they must allow the people democratically to choose the governments of their choice. We know, of course, that the African Union has tried to play an important role in sanctioning countries that don't respect democracy. But there has been criticism of the African Union in that it has not appeared to take any action against leaders on the continent who believe they are traditional leaders and can rule forever. We